Well, first, I think if I did not believe in my core, which I do, that investing for the long term is what every leader should do, I wouldn't survive there and I wouldn't be accepted. But I think that what I've seen throughout my career is that if you don't invest for the long term, you're actually sowing the seeds of your own destruction. And I actually learned that really early on at Morgan Stanley. I had the opportunity to work on an M&A deal, the hostile defense of Gillette. And that deal was subsequently written up in the book From Good to Great. And the reason was Gillette was the subject of this hostile takeover. We were asked to find a way to defend them. But the CEO at the time, Colin Mockler, I'll never forget it, the most extraordinary man, said, you can do anything you want, but you can't touch my R&D budget, and I will not tell you what it's for, but I will tell you that I do not want to be independent if I do not have those R&D dollars. And at the time, it was frustrating. We're like, we need some of it. We've got to have some of it. And he was adamant. We were able to keep the company independent, and years later, only years later, did we learn that was the sensor razor. And he was right when he said, without that R&D budget, without planning for the future, it's just not worth it. So the most important point is I do believe it's imperative to invest for the long term. But I think the other thing is people need to make choices. And that sort of goes to the financial crisis. I learned so many things working with Hank Paulson. One of the things he said was that you have to have the will and the means. And too often by the time you have the will, namely the political will, you no longer have the means. And when I moved out here from New York and I was often asked about the financial crisis, I thought that was a bit odd because things are glorious and growing out here, and that's very different than the days in the financial crisis. But then I realized that some of those lessons were as relevant here as they were during the financial crisis, which is don't waste the really good time and spend without or invest without care to whether it's a great idea or a mediocre idea just because you can. Put your effort behind the things that matter. Make sure that when you have the means, you also have the will. And so all I was trying to do, and have been trying to do, is create the visibility into the data so that our amazing business partners can make the choice. It's not me making the choice. I think that would be grossly arrogant to think that if you're not the product leader, you know how to stack rank all of the incredible things you're working on. But until people have the data, it's hard to make the choices. And there's a phrase also at Alphabet, at Google, anchor everything in data and the rest will follow. So my goal was actually to just give them the data in a way that helped people better understand how much they were putting behind each of the various options so they could then make choices and stack rank. Now, obviously, unless you squeeze the envelope tight enough, nobody has to make choices. So that's where probably some of the nicknames come in. But, but for all of you, the tools that you have, the skills that you learned here, the ability to lay things out clearly, if you anchor everything in analytical rigor, the data should help guide the best decision making.
Was that something that you had also done when you took on the CFO role at Morgan Stanley? Is that something that you had to implement in place, or was it there?
Oh, I think that on every assignment that I worked on as a banker, my view is, let's start with the question to whoever the client is. Here's my understanding of your hierarchy of objectives. Do I have it right? Like, I want to hear what people are solving for. And it can be intellectual, it can be emotional, whatever it is. What's your hierarchy of objectives? Once you know what you're solving for, you can come up with a solution. And then the answer has to be able to be, in my view, presented with analytical rigor, because numbers are a way of framing what's the opportunity set, what are the trade-offs, what's the downside potential. But the numbers actually force a clarity of thought. Like one of my dad's lines, again, when I was a little kid, he came home from SLAC, and he said, if a physicist in his lab could not define a quark in less than 60 seconds, they did not know what they were talking about. And I've used that quark test for years with colleagues. Like, if you can't tell me what you're doing and why in less than 60 seconds, it's because you're not thinking clearly. And if you can't express it in numbers, you're probably not thinking clearly. So the quark test at Morgan Stanley and amongst my Google colleagues, they know what the quark test is, and I think it's a really helpful way to try and get a pithy answer